Hi everyone, this is Jerry. This is a game from the 1972 World Chess Championship between Bobby Fischer and Boris Spassky. It was a round 10 game. Fischer had the white pieces and opened with e4. Best by test, as he would say. Spassky plays e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop to b5. So this indicates the Ruy Lopez or Spanish game. Pressure on the knight, indirect pressure on the pawn. I'll just be showing some alternative variations. This is there's a lot to know with the Ruy Lopez. There's a lot of theory on it. I'll just be touching on some what ifs. In the game we saw a6, but what if knight f6? Pressure against e4. We could see white simply castling and black opting to go for the Berlin defense, grabbing on e4, and the following sequence of moves coming about, where the end result, looking on the black side and black's deficiencies, is that the black king is uncastled and has a little messed up pawn structure, but as compensation has the bishop pair in an open position, which is usually an asset. So that's a little trade-off that would occur from that position, but we don't see that, but instead a6 chases the bishop back to a4. One other quick note, if you try to grab this pawn like this, queen d4 is played, these two are hit, the pawn will be regained. So that's why we see bishop back. And now knight f6, hitting e4. White simply ignores that threat and castles in this game. Bishop e7 was played, but again, what if knight takes pawn? This indicates the Tash variation. Can this pawn be taken without black getting killed? Well, the answer is no, but you have to know how to react to that sort of move. d4 to just try and open up this position at a moment where white is ahead in development and the black king has yet to castle. This e5 is really going to come into play in this sort of variation. b5, bishop b3, and now an important point in this position. As black, you can't be greedy. You can't just go ahead and grab pawns like this. That'll be met with rook e1, and you're in an uncomfortable pin. How to really meet this threat against your knight, which is unprotected and pinned. d5 could be met sharply with knight c3, and if you grab my knight, I'm going to grab the bishop, and for those of you who are jiu-jitsu fans, you'll know that black from this position will be tapping out very shortly. These two knights are hit directly, this rook is hit indirectly, all by just one white piece, and this knight is really just doomed. It's really caught in a crossfire, hit by both the bishop and rook. So it's just bad news for black from this position, not to be recommended going into this specific variation. However, from this point right here, instead of taking the pawn, we could see simply d5, a much better response, opting to allow the bishop come to this e6 square, as well as allow this pawn to support this e4 knight. After pawn takes pawn, just to summarize it very briefly, the material has been restored, and it's just much more playable position for sure. We don't see this. We don't see the Tash variation, but instead black opts for bishop to e7, more development, and it is at this point that black is maybe getting ready to really grab that pawn and hang on to it. So only at this point here does white choose to go ahead and defend this pawn. What's interesting to note is that there are other ways to go ahead and watch over e4. You could play d3, watches over e4. You could play knight c3. Both of these outlined moves that I have in blue watch over this e4 pawn, so why aren't they played? In the Ruy Lopez, it's important for you to know what sort of plan to implement, what sort of middle game strategy should you try to undertake. Knowing this thing will allow you to know why rook to e1 is the preferred move from such a position. Here is what you want to do as white. You want to make a move like pawn to c3 followed by pawn to d4. You want to establish two pawns in the center on these two specific squares and maintain them on those two squares for as long as you can. And I emphasize maintain for a very important reason, which I will get to later. c3 is played for a couple of reasons. Again, to support this d4 advance, as well as provide a cubbyhole for this bishop on the c2 square. And taking that into account, if that's what we want to do, it stands to reason that's why we shouldn't make a move like knight to c3. because we want to have our pawn here. And we don't play pawn to d3 because we don't want this pawn to play the role of a defensive piece. We want it to have, its aspirations are to get to d4, where it is an aggressive piece, putting pressure on this e5 pawn. So with that in mind, that's why we're seeing the move rook to e1. One additional benefit of this rook move to e1 is that f1 is vacated, so that this sort of knight type of maneuver is possible. It's often the case that in this opening the position will close up. When that occurs, this sort of maneuvering type of moves just in general are more likely to occur. And so you could see the knight take this sort of journey where it starts at b1, of course, and it ends up on g3, with its ideal square focusing on this f5 point, a soft point in the black position. So those are some things to be aware of. This is why we're playing rook here, because we want to take into account what white's plan is going to be, and we're also vacating f1 for our b1 knight. At this point, white is actually getting ready to go ahead and chop on c6 and then on e5 and simply be up a pawn. If black castles at this point, we could just go ahead and go for this. And notice how this move here, queen d4, it's not the same. White has clearly done some more development prior to grabbing the pawn. There's no queen takes pawn from this variation. The rook is, of course, watching over it. So, after rook to e1, now we see this pawn to b5 move, chasing the bishop to b3, and now black opts to play d6. What's interesting to me is why d6 is played here opposed to just castling. Castling will allow black to at least consider going into the martial attack. For example, if c3 is played here, black could, if you're an aggressive player, as black, you could be making this pawn to d5 move, giving up a pawn in exchange for pressure against the white king. These are the moves that you would see played. c6, a move like bishop d6, the queen could jet out to h4 to try and induce some pawn move for white, try to induce some sort of pawn advance, which creates a weakness against a white king which is lacking defensive pieces. More specifically, look at the queen side. Just take a quick glance. None of them have been moved, so white is lagging in development. So that's really where a lot of the compensation lies from such a variation. We're not seeing this, but again, that's just something that kind of interests me here. After bishop b3, why not just simply castle and at least reserve the option to play d6 or d5? But nevertheless, what we see is just d6 here, and now c3, and only then castle. So keeping in mind what we want to do, we want to play this d4 move. However, we don't want to play it just yet, and there's a big reason why. If we play d4 right now, what black could do is play bishop g4, and the word that I was previously emphasizing is this word maintained. Not only do we want to establish two pawns on d4 and e4, but we want to be able to maintain them there for as long as we can. There's a big reason for this, and it's because this pawn on d4 is the one who could really change the pawn structure whenever it wants. It could capture on e4, or it could push forward, or not, let me just back up. It could capture on, after bishop g4, it could capture on e5, open up the position, or it could opt to play d5 and close up the position. Being in that sort of setup where you have the option to really change the pawn structure, to open the position up or to close the position, really makes a big deal, because for as long as you keep black guessing what you're going to do, it's very difficult for black to meet those sorts of ideas. Will white open up the position? Is white going to close up the position? We really want to keep black guessing for as long as we can. But if we play d4 right away like this, bishop g4 will do what's referred to as resolve this tension in the center. This tension cannot be maintained because of the pressure that's now being placed on the white position. More specifically, this knight on f3 is a critical defender of this d4 square, And with this bishop now getting ready to not only take this knight, for example, let me just say play a nothing type of move. If a3 is played, if bishop takes knight, we can't recapture with the queen because we're going to lose on d4. And if we capture like this, well, notice how we've weakened our own kingside structure. So, in other words, it's important to insert this move right here for white. Instead of d4 right away, we want to play h3 to prevent this bishop from coming here, because again, not only do we want to establish pawns here in the center, but we want to maintain them there for as long as we can. So, knight b8 seems a bit awkward. That goes into what's known as the Brier variation. Knight to b8. Its intention is to reposition itself on this d7 square, have the knights connected, and also it allows for this c5 advance. So notice, for as long as the knight is on c6, this pawn can, of course, not move at all. So the knight move allows this pawn on c7 to advance, where it could then meet this, challenge this pawn that white is going to be placing on d4 very soon. One other variation, black could go for knight a5 and bishop here, followed by c5. We could see d4, queen c7. This is another way to go about things, but we're not seeing that. Instead, the Brier variation, knight b8, followed by knight b to d7 will be in effect. And only now d4. So finally we've made all the prep moves necessary, c3, h3, and only now d4. Knight b to d7, essentially developing move, right? Underdeveloped, and now we have to get it back into play. Knight b to d2 and bishop to b7. Notice how by putting pressure immediately on this point right here, black is restraining this d2 knight. I was mentioning earlier that this knight would like to get to f1, maybe g3, but we can't do that just yet. That pawn will fall. So by putting pressure on the white center, we stop this sort of maneuver. Bishop back to c2 lends a supporter of this e4 point, and also allows this pawn to come to b4. White is anticipating that black will be playing c5, so white wants to get this b pawn involved in the fight for control of the center. Rook e8, getting ready to tuck the bishop here, where the rook would then add potential pressure against this e4 pawn. b4, bishop back, allows again the rook to see this pawn here, and now we see a4. Again, a move like knight to f1 can't be played because after capture this pawn is hit 3 times and will be won next. So knight to f1 is out. Instead we see pawn to a4 striking at this pawn. This rook pawn is hitting a knight pawn, and this a file could potentially open up on white's terms. Knight b6 looks to resolve this tension, and Fischer opts to simply play a5. One other alternative, white could go ahead and capture like this, but I think black would be the side that's in a better position to cope with the tension that is now going on between these two rooks. Black could simply maybe make a move like rook or queen d7, and then the rooks would be in direct contact with one another. For example, bishop b2, queen here. These rooks are in direct contact with one another. The white queen, is interfering with these rooks for the moment, and you may very well see maybe a move like knight to a4, causing maybe white some problems, since it would be hitting this bishop and pawn right here. You may very well see white having to give this bishop up for the knight. So that's why we're maybe not seeing this pawn exchange right here in this position, but instead a5. If the knight goes here, that'll just run into a loss of pawn. So a5 kicks the knight back to d7. So it may seem insignificant, but the knight coming to b6, a5, and then the knight going back to d7. Its main purpose was just to resolve the tension that was going on between those two pawns. Bishop b2 gets the last minor piece involved, and it looks a little bit awkwardly placed because it's just staring at its own pawn. But in anticipation of this advance here, soon enough this bishop will be able to see the black position a little bit more clearly. So queen b8, an interesting move. What's its intention? To watch over this e5 pawn in a very indirect way. There's some more work that needs to be done before the queen is watching over e5 directly. This pawn will have to move, and this pawn on d6 will have to move, but this is the idea that's in mind with this queen b8 maneuver. Rook to b1, a little bit of an awkward move. What is its purpose? To watch over this bishop in anticipation of what black will be wanting to do. What does black want to do in this position? He wants to get this c7 pawn involved. If black doesn't make that sort of move, what more really is there in the position? So what we do see is c5. We have a series of exchanges, and soon enough this bishop, which looked dumb on b2, springs to life. We have a bunch of exchanges going on e5. After the queen recaptures, pawn to c4. So what was the purpose of rook b1? Watch over this bishop so it's protected and this c4 move could come about. The queen is now hit, queen f4, and now the bishop simply grabs this knight. I'm not sure what else could be played here. If pawn takes pawn, that could run into some trouble with maybe this sort of pin. The knight is hit once, maybe there's this pin going on, right? How to really meet that threat, and maybe this knight could grab here on the next turn. So that's why we're not seeing that sort of capture go on, pawn takes pawn, because of the pressure that could be placed on this d2 knight. Instead, bishop takes knight, queen takes bishop, and only now pawn takes pawn. And rook on e to d8, a very, very sharp move, looking to, well, first and foremost, placing the knight in a pin, but black is now getting ready to place this queen very deep in the white position where she really radiates, really shows herself quite well, placing this, hitting this knight again, and also hitting this a5 pawn. So white simply gets out of that pin right away, and queen c3 hits this knight for a second time. We can play this nice regrouping type of move, moving it to its most natural square, classical square on f3. And after queen takes pawn, we see bishop to b3. This is an interesting move. With this tension between these two pawns, you may very well be tempted as white to maybe just grab this pawn here, but Fischer is starting to look at this king here and how this point on f7, this pawn on f7, is a bit vulnerable. If you could attack it once and maybe even a second time, that starts to be an issue. And sure enough, in this game, pressure starts to mount against this pawn right here on f7. So let's start out first with bishop b3, places that pawn in a pin. And after pawn takes pawn, we have queen to f4. So this pawn is hit twice. Some calculation was, of course, needed with this sequence of moves, bishop b3, queen f4. What calculation exactly? Well, you got to know how to cope with this move here, of course. Normally, if there weren't any tactics in this position, this c4 move would just, slam a door in this bishop's face. But we could just capture like this, and then the rook is there to just come to the 7th rank and cause some more problems for black. So queen f4 is played. This move is out of the question, and now we have rook d7 adding a supporter. Knight e5 attacking the rook and the pawn, so we're just piling up on f7 at this point. The queen comes back to defend f7 indirectly and place the knight in a pin against the queen. And now we have rook b to d1. This is a very, very important point in the game. We can't just make any rook move. This rook on e1 is contributing in some way to the position. It's watching over e4. This rook, its only intention previously was to watch over a bishop that was on b2. It has finished its duty in doing that. So it's time to get that rook involved. So that's why we're seeing rook b to d1. And after rook to e7, we have a series of exchanges occurring on f7, and we quickly arrive at an endgame position, which is unbalanced. We have these two pawns which are together, they're connected pass pawns, and we end up having an unbalanced position where Fischer is able to show some really good technique in bringing the point home. Bishop takes pawn, rook takes bishop, so a series of exchanges, and at this point bishop takes pawn here. If king takes knight, we just have rook check, and grab the bishop. So taking on e4 first will allow black to gain additional material prior to grabbing on f7. So bishop takes, rook takes, king takes, and now rook on the 7th, giving a check, and king to f6. So essentially what you want to do as white in this position is restrain these guys from pressing forward. So ideally the rook came here not to just check, but it really wants to get to this b7 square, wants to get behind these pawns to prevent them from pressing forward. So rook b7, rook check, king h2, bishop d6 check, g3, and now b4. So finally the threat rook takes b5 was met, and now what do we do with the endgame? We get our kings involved, king g2, h5. I'm not quite sure what that does. Maybe just, prevents this g4 move from coming about. It's really difficult to suggest good moves for black in this position because these white rooks are placed very well. They're really stopping the white pawns from advancing. Neither move could come about without the loss of material for black. So just rook b6, really just trying to tie black up as best you can. The bishop is now pinned, so rook moves there to defend. King f3, king back to get out of the pin, king e2. This rook is lacking squares. It really could only go to d5 to still be in direct contact with the bishop. And f4, we have a 3 versus 2 majority, so we got to get these 3 pawns rolling. So that's why we're seeing this advancement, f4. We're going to see g4 as well. In the meantime, what could black do? Not a whole lot. In fact, this rook right here doesn't have any reasonable moves. Any moves would result in the loss of material. So black has to resort to this sort of pawn move. Black is very close to just being in zugzwang. So I mean, I guess there could be a move like bishop back here, but really nothing concrete is coming about with the black moves here. So g6, g4, we have the exchange of pawns, and now g5, looking to maybe just grab the last of the white pawns, maybe after something like this. Maybe if black could grab this pawn here at some point, of course this bishop is hanging, but ideally what black would like to do in this position is really just trade all of the white pawns and just get into an ending where it's the rook and bishop versus the 2 white rooks. That's a much more drawable sort of position. So in response to g5, Fischer wants to maintain those pawns on the board, so that's why we see f5. Bishop to e5, preventing this rook from maybe making use of e6. In fact, there could be very well threats like rook b7, and if the king comes here, that would actually run into mate, rook to e6. So the bishop to e5 move stops the rook from accessing these squares here. So rook b5 pins this pawn to the rook, which allows this move right here, rook takes pawn. And black is pretty much in a bind right here. The move played was king to f6, allowing rook takes pawn, but there really wasn't a way to avoid it. For example, if you move this bishop, we could see rook check, king here. That's really the only move, right? Because you go here, you get mated, and if you go here, you get mated. So this is the only move from this position. And actually, what we would see from here is a move like king to d3. Notice how we don't have to worry about this discovered check. The bishop could go wherever it wants. We have all our pieces on light squares. This guy is not going to bother us at all. So the king could kind of just shift over and alleviate this rook's duty of watching over this pawn from advancing. So this king could come to c2 and watch over this pawn's advancement. And in the meantime, this rook could eventually, come over in this direction and maybe threaten to come here at some point. Maybe get ready to press forward on f6. So things like that are in the air if black isn't careful. So considering those sorts of ideas that white has, black is opting to just allow this sort of capture to occur. So king f6, rook grabs the pawn, and now bishop to d4. Grabbing the rook going into this endgame is simply lost. Pawn here, rook here, pawn here, and the king is just going to sneak over here and just grab this pawn next. These 2 pawns right here are connected, so it's a big asset in almost all pawn endings, so this ending right here would be no exception. So we don't see that sort of exchange. After rook takes pawn, simply bishop d4. White throws in a check here, king to e5, and now a sharp move right here by Fischer, king to f3, threatening mate. There's no time to grab this rook because of rook e6. So how to meet that? The rook simply retreats, allowing the king to make use of d5 in the event of a check. And now white offers these rook exchanges. This is a good strategy. If you're up material, offer some exchanges. So that's what we have with this sequence of moves. And once these rooks are in this position right here, now we have this possibility where the rook could come to g6, getting ready to grab him, and then it's just going to be bad news for black. So finishing up, we have king d5, the rook grabs the pawn, bishop e5, f6, pins the bishop to the king, and after king to d4, we have rook to b1, and from this position, black resigns, and for good reason. How to really meet this threat right here where the rook is getting ready to just check the king and then grab the rook. There's really no convenient way to do it because this king, unfortunately, from this position is tied down to having to defend this bishop here. So if something like this occurs, just showing you one variation, if bishop takes pawn, we could simply see, really just pick your favorite variation. This would be one of them. Rook takes, king here. We could just simply grab this pawn and then grab this rook, and this is going to be a one game. So as it went in this game, after king to d4 and rook to b1, Spassky ends up resigning. So that's all for this video. Hope you're able to take something away from it. Take care.